On a warm summer evening, the Peterson estate glittered with fairy lights strung across the wide-open lawn. The scent of fresh-cut roses hung in the air, mingling with the faint saltiness from the nearby ocean. It was the wedding of the season, a lavish celebration designed to showcase unity and love. But beneath the polished smiles and clinking champagne flutes, another story was quietly unfurling, one that would redefine the bonds of family forever. Eric Hartman, the groom, stood near the altar, his tailored navy tuxedo a stark contrast to the casual charm of the weathered barn in the distance. His heart was racing, though not with the giddy excitement one might expect from a groom on his wedding day. Instead, it was the weight of watching everyone he loved gathered in one place, a rare occurrence that felt bittersweet. Eric's family was a patchwork quilt of complexity. His father, Ronald, was a retired contractor with hands as rough as sandpaper and a laugh that could fill a room. His mother, Linda, was a force of nature, the type of woman who could host a charity gala on a Friday night and bake cookies for the church bake sale by Saturday morning. They were proud but practical people, the kind who taught Eric and his younger brother, Caleb, the value of hard work and honesty. Caleb, though, was the golden child, the charismatic younger brother with a natural charm that Eric could never quite match. While Eric had taken the steady path of business school and a career in finance, Caleb was the dreamer, the artist who wandered through life with a guitar on his back and a devil-may-care grin. They were close in childhood, but adulthood had brought subtle shifts, creating cracks in their bond that neither brother fully understood. Eric adjusted his tie for the third time, glancing at the crowd of guests. His bride, Alice, would be arriving any moment now. She had always been the social butterfly of their circle, the one who seemed to fit effortlessly into any crowd. Her laughter was infectious, her presence magnetic. Eric adored her, though sometimes he felt like a quiet shadow in the wake of her brilliance. When the music started, a soft piano melody signaling Alice's arrival, Eric turned toward the aisle, his breath catching at the sight of her. She was radiant, her lace gown shimmering in the golden hour light. But as she approached, his smile faltered, replaced by an odd unease he couldn't quite place. Her eyes weren't on him. Instead, they flitted to someone in the front row, Caleb. It was subtle, but Eric noticed. And in that brief exchange, a glance, a half-smile, something cold and uneasy curled in the pit of his stomach. The Peterson clan, Alice's family, was no less complex. Alice's father, David, was a stoic man with a penchant for bourbon and an almost obsessive focus on appearances. Her mother, Claire, was the polar opposite, a whirlwind of affection who could disarm even the most hardened guest with a single warm embrace. The two families were different, yet they had bonded during the wedding planning process. Eric had secretly hoped this newfound camaraderie might ease some of the subtle tensions between him and Alice. But as the night unfolded, Eric's unease deepened. Alice was the picture-perfect bride, laughing and twirling on the dance floor. Yet her laughter seemed too bright, her movements too rehearsed. And every so often, Eric noticed her slipping away, only to find her deep in conversation with Caleb. At first, Eric dismissed it as innocent chatter. They had grown close during the months leading up to the wedding, bonding over shared interests in music and literature. Alice had always admired Caleb's free spirit, often commenting on how different he was from Eric. "He's a breath of fresh air," she had said once, laughing. Eric had laughed along, not realizing how deeply her words would echo. By the time the cake was cut, the air between Eric and Alice felt charged with an unspoken tension. She was on Caleb's arm again, laughing at something he'd said, her hand lingering on his sleeve. Eric approached cautiously, forcing a smile. "Mind if I steal my wife for a moment?" he asked, his tone light. Alice looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there. Caleb's grin faded slightly, but he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All yours, big bro." Eric guided Alice to a quieter corner of the reception. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low but firm. She hesitated, her perfect smile slipping for just a moment. "Of course. It's our wedding day." "Then maybe spend it with me," he said, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. Alice's brows knitted together, and for the first time, Eric saw a flicker of something in her eyes, guilt, perhaps, or defiance. "You're being ridiculous, Eric. Caleb and I are just talking." "Maybe I am," Eric replied, stepping back. "But it doesn't feel like it." As the evening wore on, Eric's world began to unravel. He overheard whispers from guests, comments about how close Alice and Caleb seemed, how natural they looked together. A well-meaning cousin pulled him aside, her expression concerned. "Eric, I don't want to upset you, but, is everything okay with Alice and Caleb?" He forced a laugh. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? But the truth was, everything felt wrong. When Eric saw Alice slip out of the reception, Caleb following shortly after, he could no longer ignore the nagging voice in his head. He followed them, his heart pounding as he approached the barn at the edge of the estate. Inside, beneath the dim light of a single bulb, Alice and Caleb stood close, too close. Their voices were low, but Eric could hear the intimacy in their tone, the way they leaned into each other as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. "Alice?" Eric's voice cut through the stillness, startling them both. She turned, her face a mixture of shock and something else, resignation. Caleb stepped back, guilt etched across his features. "Eric, I..." But Eric didn't wait for an explanation. He turned and walked away, the sounds of the wedding fading behind him as he left the estate. The night air was cool against his skin, but inside, he burned with betrayal. Eric drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, the glow of the city lights flickering across his windshield. The once reverent joy of the day had dissolved into a sharp, throbbing ache that settled deep in his chest. His mind raced, replaying the image of Alice and Caleb standing too close, their voices hushed, their bodies angled toward one another as if they were the only two people in the world. The betrayal cut in layers, each one deeper than the last. It wasn't just Alice, his wife, who had shattered his trust, but Caleb, his own brother, the one person he thought would never betray him. Eric had always known they were different, Caleb the wild flame to his steady ember, but this? This crossed every boundary Eric thought they'd built as brothers. As the hours ticked by, Eric found himself parked on a desolate stretch of beach, the rhythmic crashing of the waves a stark contrast to the chaos inside him. He sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Why?" he whispered into the empty space, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. He thought about turning back, storming into the reception, and demanding answers. But the thought of facing Alice, or worse, Caleb, made his stomach churn. He wasn't ready to hear their excuses or their denials. He needed time to think, to process the shards of his broken wedding day before confronting the people who had shattered it. Back at the estate, the celebration continued as if nothing had happened. Alice had returned to the dance floor, her laughter louder than before, her steps exaggerated as though trying to mask her guilt with frivolity. Caleb, too, had rejoined the crowd, his easy charm slipping effortlessly back into place. If anyone noticed the tension between them, they didn't comment on it, chalking it up to the normal stresses of a wedding. Linda, Eric's mother, wasn't so easily convinced. She had watched her eldest son leave the reception earlier, his face pale and drawn, his movements stiff with unspoken tension. She had always been good at reading her boys, and something about Eric's sudden departure, and the way Alice and Caleb seemed to gravitate toward each other, set off alarms in her mind. "Have you seen Eric?" Linda asked her husband, Ronald, as they swayed gently on the dance floor. "I saw him step outside a while ago," Ronald replied, frowning. "Maybe he needed some air." Linda nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She excused herself from the dance floor and began searching the estate, her worry growing with every empty room she checked. When she finally stepped outside and saw the driveway empty, her stomach sank. Something was terribly wrong. Meanwhile, Eric found himself dialing the one person he thought might offer some clarity, his best friend, Jason. "Eric?" Jason answered groggily, the late hour evident in his voice. "Man, it's past midnight. Shouldn't you be celebrating with your new wife?" The mention of Alice made Eric's throat tighten. He swallowed hard, gripping the phone like a lifeline. "I need to talk, Jace. It's bad." Jason's tone shifted immediately, the grogginess replaced by concern. "Where are you?" "By the beach," Eric replied. I couldn't stay." "I'm on my way," Jason said without hesitation. "Sit tight." 15 minutes later, Jason's car pulled up beside Eric's, the headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to settle over the water. He climbed out, his jeans rumpled and his hoodie pulled hastily over his head. Sliding into the passenger seat, he looked at Eric, his expression serious. Okay, spill, Jason said. Eric hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Saying it out loud would make it real, and part of him still hoped this was some horrible misunderstanding. But the memory of Alice's hand on Caleb's arm, the way they had leaned into each other, shattered that hope. I think Alice and Caleb are, Eric trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. His voice was thick with emotion as he clenched his jaw, staring out at the waves. Jason's eyes widened in disbelief. Wait. Are you saying, your brother? At your wedding? Eric nodded, his chest tightening as he finally forced the words out. I saw them, Jace. In the barn. Too close. Talking like there was something between them. Jason let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. Man, that's messed up. I don't know what to do, Eric admitted, his voice breaking. How do I even start to deal with this? My wife. My brother. On my wedding day. Jason was quiet for a moment, his usual quick wit replaced by thoughtful silence. Look, he said finally, you need answers before you do anything else. You can't make decisions based on assumptions. Confront Alice. Talk to Caleb if you have to. But don't let this sit in your head and fester. Eric nodded, though the thought of facing either of them made him feel sick. He didn't trust himself to stay calm, didn't trust them to give him the truth. But Jason was right, he needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. When Eric finally returned to the estate hours later, the celebration had wound down. The fairy lights still twinkled in the trees, but the lawn was littered with empty glasses and wilted flowers. Inside, the last of the guests were saying their goodbyes. Alice stood by the door, her smile faltering when she saw him. Caleb was nowhere in sight. Eric, she said softly, stepping toward him. Where have you been? I was worried. He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of remorse or guilt. She looked beautiful, as always, but now that beauty felt like a mask, a thin veneer hiding something darker beneath. We need to talk, he said, his voice low and firm. Alice hesitated, glancing around at the remaining guests. Can it wait? It's late, Anne. No, Eric interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. It can't. As he led her away from the crowd, his heart pounded with a mixture of dread and determination. The truth was waiting just beyond the edge of their carefully constructed facade, and Eric was finally ready to face it. Eric led Alice through the quiet halls of the estate, his hand clenched tightly around hers. The warmth of her touch, once a source of comfort, now felt foreign, an unwanted reminder of the betrayal he couldn't yet name but knew existed. He stopped in the grand sitting room, where the remnants of the evening's celebration lingered, empty glasses, a forgotten bouquet, the faint scent of champagne in the air. He let go of her hand and turned to face her. Eric, Alice started, her voice soft, almost pleading. What's wrong? You disappeared for hours. Don't, Eric said, his tone sharper than he intended. Just, don't. Alice blinked, taken aback. She crossed her arms, an automatic defense mechanism he knew well. You're scaring me. What's going on? Eric studied her, searching her face for cracks in the perfect facade. Her eyes, wide and confused, darted away from his when he didn't immediately answer. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, each word measured and deliberate. What were you doing in the barn with Caleb? Alice froze, her entire body stiffening like a deer caught in headlights. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unrelenting. Her hesitation was answer enough, but Eric waited, his stomach twisting as the silence stretched on. I don't know what you mean, she finally said, her voice trembling. Eric laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. Don't play dumb, Alice. I saw you. Talking. Standing too close. You think I wouldn't notice? On our wedding day. Alice opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if struggling to find the right words. It wasn't what you think, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Then tell me what it was, Eric snapped. His anger bubbled just beneath the surface, barely contained. Because from where I was standing, it looked like you couldn't keep your hands off my brother. Alice flinched, color rising in her cheeks. Eric, please. Caleb and I were just talking. That's all. Talking, Eric repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. Talking so closely you didn't notice the entire wedding happening around you. Talking so intimately you didn't even see me standing there. It's not like that, she insisted, shaking her head. You're blowing this out of proportion. Am I? Eric stepped back, his voice rising. Because it sure as hell feels like I'm the only one who noticed how cozy you two have been lately. The little jokes, the lingering looks. Stop it. Alice interrupted, her voice cracking. You're being paranoid. Don't you dare turn this around on me, Eric shot back, his anger breaking through. You think I'm making this up? I saw the way you looked at him tonight, Alice. I've seen it before, every time you light up when he's in the room, every time you brush me off like I'm just some obligation. Alice's eyes filled with tears, but Eric didn't falter. What do you want me to say, Eric? She asked, her voice trembling. That I admire him. That he's charming and funny and easy to talk to. He's your brother. Of course I care about him. But that's all it is. Do you honestly expect me to believe that? Eric demanded, his chest tight with the weight of her words. You've been crossing lines for months, Alice. Maybe you didn't mean to, maybe you didn't even realize it, but you're not going to stand here and lie to me. Not tonight. Alice covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as silent sobs overtook her. For a fleeting moment, Eric felt the sting of guilt, but it was quickly eclipsed by the raw ache of his own betrayal. He let the silence drag on, giving her space to respond, to confess, to say something that would make sense of the chaos swirling in his mind. Finally, she dropped her hands and looked at him, her tear-streaked face pale and vulnerable. I love you, Eric, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I married you. Not Caleb. You have to believe me. Eric stared at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. Then prove it, he said softly. Tell me there's nothing going on. Swear to me that tonight was nothing but a misunderstanding. Alice hesitated, the flicker of guilt in her eyes returning for the briefest moment before she nodded. I swear, she whispered. There's nothing going on. But Eric didn't believe her. He couldn't. The tension between them remained thick as they left the sitting room, Eric retreating to the guest house on the far edge of the property while Alice returned to the main house. She texted him once, I'm sorry. Please don't let this ruin us. But he didn't reply. Sleep eluded him that night, his mind racing with every possible scenario, every missed clue. Morning brought little relief. Eric avoided Alice, opting to pack his things while the house was still quiet. But as he loaded his bags into the trunk of his car, he saw Caleb walking toward him, hands stuffed in his pockets. You're leaving already? Caleb asked, his tone light, as if nothing was amiss. Eric turned slowly, his jaw tightening. Don't act like you don't know why. Caleb's smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion, or was it guilt? What are you talking about? You and Alice, Eric said bluntly. Whatever this thing is between you. Caleb's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. Eric, come on. There's no thing. Alice is your wife. She's. Don't, Eric interrupted, his voice cold. Don't lie to me, Caleb. I don't need excuses or denials. I need the truth. Caleb's expression darkened, his easygoing demeanor slipping. You think I'd do that to you? He asked, his voice tinged with anger. You think I'd go after my brother's wife? Seriously? I don't know what to think anymore, Eric admitted, his voice rising. But I do know what I saw. And what exactly did you see? Caleb asked, his tone sharp now. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're jumping to conclusions. I saw the way she looks at you, Eric said, his voice raw. I saw the way you look at her. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. You really want to do this here? Now. Eric held his ground, his anger surging. Why not? You've already ruined everything else. Caleb's eyes flashed with something unreadable, regret, perhaps, or defiance. You're my brother, he said finally, his voice heavy. I'd never hurt you. Not like that. Then why does it feel like you already have? Eric shot back. Caleb didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Eric alone with the weight of his unanswered questions and the growing certainty that the worst was yet to come. Eric drove back to his apartment with a singular focus: escape. The wedding, Alice, Caleb, and the betrayal, all of it felt suffocating, the weight pressing down on him with every mile he put between himself and the Peterson estate. The world outside the car blurred into a haze of morning light and muted greens, but inside, Eric's thoughts burned sharp and vivid. What had Alice meant when she said she admired Caleb? Why had Caleb walked away rather than deny everything? Every memory of the past few months replayed in his mind, tainted now by suspicion. Alice laughing at Caleb's jokes at a family barbecue, the way her eyes lingered on him during Thanksgiving dinner, Caleb showing up uninvited to small gatherings meant for just Eric and Alice. When Eric finally arrived home, the silence of his apartment felt both a relief and a punishment. The echo of his own footsteps across the hardwood floors reminded him of how empty his life would feel if his worst fears were confirmed. He sank into the couch, his head in his hands, and for the first time since walking away from the wedding, he let the tears fall. Meanwhile, back at the Peterson estate, Alice paced the length of the guest room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She had called Eric twice since he'd left, but both calls went straight to voicemail. She didn't dare text him again, not after the unanswered message from the night before. The last thing she wanted was to appear desperate, though desperation was exactly what she felt. Caleb knocked softly on the doorframe before stepping inside. His usual carefree demeanor was replaced with something heavier, almost somber. "He left?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Alice nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is a disaster." Caleb sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that there's nothing going on between us," Alice said, her voice shaking. "But he doesn't believe me." "Caleb, he thinks," she broke off, unable to finish the thought. "That we're having an affair," Caleb finished for her, his tone flat. Alice flinched, as though hearing the words aloud made them more real. "I don't know what to do," she said, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "I love him, Caleb. I chose him. How do I make him see that?" Caleb hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Maybe you should have thought about that before all this." Alice looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Caleb crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Come on, Alice. You've been flirting with the line for months. All those late-night talks, the inside jokes, the way you lean on me when you're upset with him. You can't honestly say Eric's the only one responsible for feeling this way." Alice's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might argue. But then her shoulders sagged, and she buried her face in her hands. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt him. And yet, here we are," Caleb said quietly. 2 days passed before Eric finally checked his messages. His phone was full of missed calls from Alice and a single voicemail from his mother. He played it reluctantly, bracing himself for the wave of guilt he knew was coming. "Eric, it's Mom," Linda's voice said, calm but tinged with worry. "I'm not calling to lecture you, honey. I want to make sure you're okay. I know things looked tense at the wedding, and I'm worried about you. Call me when you're ready. I love you." Eric let out a shaky breath, guilt settling in his chest like a stone. He hadn't called his parents, hadn't offered any explanation for his sudden disappearance. He wasn't even sure he had an explanation to give. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Eric frowned, glancing at the clock. He wasn't expecting anyone. Rising reluctantly, he opened the door, and froze. It was Caleb. "What the hell are you doing here?" Eric asked, his voice cold. Caleb held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight. I thought we should talk." Eric's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside, letting Caleb in. The two brothers stood in the small living room, the tension between them palpable. "Well?" Eric said after a long silence. "Talk." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Look, I know things look bad. I get why you're angry. But I need you to know, I would never do that to you. Whatever you think you saw, it's not what you think." Eric let out a bitter laugh. "You expect me to believe that? After the way you've been acting? After the way she's been acting?" I'm not denying we're close, Caleb admitted. Maybe too close. But it's not what you think. Alice, she's been struggling. She confides in me because she feels like you don't listen. Eric's eyes flashed with anger. So you decided to be her confidant? My wife? Do you even realize how that looks? I wasn't trying to undermine you, Caleb said, his voice rising. I was trying to help. Help? Eric repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. By spending more time with her than I do. By letting her lean on you instead of her own husband. I didn't ask for this. Caleb snapped, his own anger finally breaking through. She came to me. She needed someone to talk to, and you were too busy being distant to notice. The words hit Eric like a slap. He stared at his brother, his anger momentarily giving way to something else, guilt, shame, confusion. Had he been distant? Had he failed Alice in some way that pushed her toward Caleb? No, Eric said finally, his voice hard. Don't put this on me. You could have said no. You could have set boundaries. Instead, you crossed lines you had no business crossing. Caleb didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. You're right. I should have set boundaries. I should have told her to talk to you instead of me. But it's done now, Eric. All I can do is tell you the truth and hope you'll believe me. Eric stared at him, his emotions warring between anger and the faintest glimmer of hope. And the truth is, there's nothing going on between me and Alice, Caleb said firmly. Not physically, not emotionally. She loves you, man. She really does. Eric's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Caleb sighed, stepping toward the door. I'll leave you alone. But think about what I said, okay? As the door closed behind him, Eric sank onto the couch, his mind racing. Caleb's words lingered, but the doubts remained. Could he trust his brother? Could he trust his wife? And even if he could, how could he move forward knowing the cracks in their relationship might never fully heal? 6 months after the disastrous wedding day, Eric Hartman stood in the shadow of his apartment's window, staring at the message on his phone. It was an invitation. Crisp white cardstock embossed with gold lettering, the kind of stationery designed to scream importance. You are cordially invited to celebrate the union of Caleb Hartman and Alice Peterson. For a moment, Eric couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. His hands trembled as he clutched the card, the words blurring in his vision. His brother. His wife. Together. Officially. Eric had spent the last half-year untangling the web of betrayal that had destroyed his life. He tried to move on, focusing on work, therapy, and the tentative connections he'd started to rebuild with his parents. But this? This was a blow he hadn't prepared for. The wounds he thought were healing reopened with a vengeance. Caleb and Alice hadn't wasted any time. The cracks in Eric's marriage had barely formed before they took the opportunity to slip into each other's lives. For months, Eric had avoided confronting the two directly, instead choosing to piece together their betrayal from whispers, rumors, and his own observations. Now, here was the final confirmation, mailed to him without shame or remorse. They wanted him to attend the wedding. He tossed the invitation onto the counter, anger coursing through his veins. His mind buzzed with a single question: why would they want me there? Eric spent the next week in a haze, debating whether to ignore the invitation or confront the two of them. In the end, curiosity and a simmering need for closure won out. He needed to see it for himself, to understand how they could stand in front of the world and call what they'd done love. The venue was strikingly familiar, a picturesque estate on the outskirts of the city. It was the same estate where Eric had married Alice just months ago. He parked his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly before forcing himself to step out. Guests milled about in formal attire, chatting and laughing as though nothing about this day was wrong. Inside, the hall was transformed, bathed in soft golden light and filled with lush floral arrangements. A string quartet played in the corner, their music elegant and serene. But to Eric, the room felt cold, devoid of the warmth and authenticity it tried so hard to mimic. He spotted his parents near the back, their faces pinched with discomfort. Linda caught sight of Eric and immediately came over, her expression a mix of guilt and sadness. You didn't have to come, she said softly, reaching for his hand. I needed to see it, Eric replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Linda hesitated. I don't agree with this, Eric. Your father doesn't either. But Caleb, she trailed off, searching for the right words. He's always had a way of convincing people he's right, even when he isn't. Eric nodded, his jaw tightening. Where are they? Linda gestured toward the garden, where the ceremony was about to begin. Eric followed her gaze, his heart pounding as he stepped through the doors and into the sunlight. The scene was surreal. Alice stood at the altar, her gown trailing behind her in a cascade of lace and satin. She looked radiant, but to Eric, the sight was hollow, an echo of the day she'd stood in that same spot with him. Caleb stood beside her, his expression one of confident ease, as though he hadn't just shattered his brother's life to claim the woman beside him. Eric slipped into the back row, unnoticed by most of the guests. As the officiant began the ceremony, he studied the faces of the couple. Caleb's smile was broad and easy, his posture relaxed. Alice, though beautiful, seemed different, her smile strained, her hands gripping her bouquet tightly. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, a heavy silence fell over the garden. Eric's pulse quickened. He thought about standing, about saying something, anything, to disrupt the farce unfolding before him. But he stayed seated, his anger too raw to channel into words. The ceremony ended in applause, the guests rising to their feet as Caleb kissed Alice. Eric stayed seated, his hands gripping the edge of his chair, his eyes locked on the couple as they walked back up the aisle. The reception was held under a grand tent, with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and tables adorned with elaborate centerpieces. Eric lingered on the outskirts, nursing a drink and trying to decide whether to leave or confront them. As the evening wore on, his opportunity came. Caleb spotted him and made his way over, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. I didn't think you'd show, Caleb said, his tone light but his eyes cautious. Eric took a slow sip of his drink before responding. Why did you invite me? Caleb shrugged. We're still family, Eric. I thought maybe we could put the past behind us. The past? Eric repeated, his voice low and sharp. You mean my marriage? My trust in you? My entire life? Caleb's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. Look, I know you're angry. You don't know anything, Eric interrupted, his voice cutting through Caleb's excuses. You think this is love? Stealing your brother's wife? Building a life on lies and betrayal? Caleb's face hardened, the charm slipping away. Alice and I didn't plan this, Eric. It just happened. You weren't what she needed, Anne. You're unbelievable, Eric said, his voice rising. You think you're the hero in this? That you swooped in to save her from a life with me? She deserves to be happy, Caleb shot back. And she wasn't happy with you. Eric stepped closer, his anger boiling over. And you think she'll be happy with you? After this? After everything you've done? Before Caleb could respond, Alice appeared beside him, her expression wary. Eric, please, she said softly. This isn't the time or place. No, it isn't, Eric agreed, his voice cold. But I'll leave you with this, happiness built on someone else's pain never lasts. Enjoy it while you can. He turned and walked away, leaving them standing there amidst the laughter and music of their perfect day. For the first time in months, Eric felt a small flicker of peace. He'd confronted them. He'd said his piece. And now, he was done. As he left the estate for the last time, he realized something important, their betrayal no longer defined him. Caleb and Alice could have their wedding, their happiness, their carefully constructed facade. Eric would find something better, something real. And that was a future worth fighting for. What would you do if your brother married your ex-wife after betraying you? Share your thoughts on this story of heartbreak and resilience.